Today we're going to talk about the biodiversity of an ecosystem. Biodiversity again means the richness and variety of life. So when we talk about biodiversity, we are specifically talking about the number of different kinds of animals or organisms that are living there, plants and animals, in a particular ecosystem or a biome. As you increase the number of these different types of organisms, you're also going to increase biodiversity. And that is the ability, the biodiversity again is the number of different types of organisms. And this is very important when we're talking about an ecosystem, because if you have more different kinds of organisms, then over time that ecosystem is more likely to survive some kind of catastrophic event, and it will sustain itself over time. Sustainability of an ecosystem is basically the ability of an ecosystem to maintain its stable structure over time. So if you have some kind of a catastrophic event, such as a tornado or a flood or a fire, something along those lines, because you have different kinds of organisms fulfilling different niches in the environment, it is more likely to be able to survive that catastrophic event. So please remember, and this is very important, I have this starred and highlighted here. As you increase the biodiversity of an ecosystem, it means it's going to be more stable. It increases the stability. So if I have more different kinds of organisms, it's more likely to survive. And I'm going to give you some examples and explain this here in just a second. So the first example here is if a drought happens and no food was available to an animal, such as an insect with wings that can fly to a different area. So if you have a drought and there's no food available, one of the animal, in this case an insect, will be able to fly someplace else to get say food somewhere else. Now that we're talking about one particular animal, that's not really biodiversity, but that's more of an adaptation of its ability to survive. But when we talk about biodiversity, you might want to say, for example, we talk about bees that pollinate many kinds of plants. Bees can, for example, their role is to, like I mentioned earlier, collect honey and to pollinate plants. Spores fall on the back of bees, they fly to other plants, those fall off, and new plants will reproduce in different areas. What happens is the bees help in the variety of different kinds of plants, but during the winter time, some of the plants, because of the cold, may die, while other plants may survive. And it's this variety that is very important, because if some of the plants die off and some survive, well, then the next spring there's still plants there that are surviving in that ecosystem. And those that died off may or may not be gone permanently, but at least the whole ecosystem did not collapse. And that's kind of the point of this variety, is the more different kinds of animals and plants you have, the more likely the entire ecosystem is going to survive. Here we have an example of a food web. And if you remove an organism from the food web, it's going to decrease the biodiversity. And in this case, I've starred a bug here that the bug eats the flowers or eats the grasses. This could be a bee, it could be anything. And we're assuming that a pesticide was introduced, and a pesticide is something that kills bugs. It was introduced that killed off all the bugs. So all the bugs died. So what happens to this ecosystem? Well, in this case, if the bug dies, first of all, the flowers and the grasses, if the bug was eating them, would probably increase in number. But we have another problem here. All of these animals right here, the birds, the mouse, the frog, the fish, they all depend upon this bug for survival. They have to eat that bug. And so if I kill off all the bugs, the birds, the mouse, the frog, and the fish will probably likely die off and or move to a different area, because those bugs are no longer there. And so everything after the bug was affected, because the entire food web would be affected because of the result of less biodiversity. Everything depends on this one bug. Now, if I had other different kinds of bugs in this ecosystem, then these animals likely would possibly be able to eat something else, but in this case they cannot. They're only eating this one bug. So this is an example of the lack of biodiversity here, because everything's dependent on one thing, and if this one thing dies off, some virus or some pesticide or whatever kills off this bug, the entire ecosystem is in trouble, and this would decrease the biodiversity. There's an interesting fact that I want to point out here, and it's related to rainforests. Rainforests their soil is actually very poor in nutrients. Now, you would think, based on the cycling of matter and all this life that's going on in a rainforest, that when an organism dies, it decays and goes into the ground, and its soil would be nutrient rich. But the point is that when something dies in the rainforest, it's very hot and humid. And what that does is that promotes the rapid decay or breakdown of matter. Those decomposing bacteria and fungi, they work much faster in a rainforest. And then on top of that, there's so much life in a rainforest, so many trees and plants and things, that as soon as that decay happens, that matter is quickly reabsorbed back into some living materials. So for this reason, the soil in an ecosystem in a rainforest is very, very nutrient poor, because that soil is quickly reabsorbed back into the environment, or back into the living systems. Please remember that living means biotic, and abiotic means non-living. We've talked about this before. The term a means non-living or without. So you need to remember these two terms. They will likely show up on a test. This right here where it's starred, this likely will be on a test too, because when the heat and humidity break down the heat and humidity will break down the organic material quickly, and in an ecosystem where the life is thriving, it just sucks that organic material back from the soil into the trees or plants or producers. Other examples of biodiversity helping stability, if you decrease, let's say for example, I have a situation here where otters love to eat shellfish, such as shrimp, crab, things like that, and because of that, otters have specially adapted claws for opening up crab or other types of shellfish. So the question is, what would happen if the shellfish suddenly died? What would happen to those otters? Well, the otters would have to adapt to eat other things in order to survive. If those things died off, they would have to make an adaptation change. If they didn't, they would either have to leave that area, or they would die off, because the otters didn't make that adaptation change to survive. So in order for otters to be able to eat other things, there have to be other things for the otters to eat and more biodiversity in that area. And if there's not anything for them to eat, or a lack of biodiversity, then what would happen is the population of the otters would decline. And so if you decrease or lower, basically, the amount of shellfish in an area as related to the otters, then the otters would either have to leave, which would lower their population, or they would die off, which would lower their population. If they had adapted to eat something else, they would stay, and the ecosystem would continue to thrive, because those otters have a role in that ecosystem. Another example would be, say, wolves helping scavengers. Vultures are a scavenger, and when a wolf dies, it provides the vultures with matter or food necessary to survive. So those vultures are looking for these wolves that die, and the vultures eat these dead wolves. So once they die, the vultures will come down and help eat those dead dead wolves. So a wolf is helping actually the sustainability of an ecosystem when it dies because it's helping these vultures. So there's another role, for example, that a wolf can have in an ecosystem. So these are things that you really wouldn't normally think about, but they are types or roles that these animals have in the ecosystem. If you reduce, for example, the number of different native species, native means species that were originally there in that location. If you reduce them by, say, having another species of something else come in and invade it, it decreases the ecosystem. There are several examples of this. Plants, often this can happen with plants, where there will be native natural plants in an area and all of a sudden a bunch of weeds come in and outgrow the plants and those plants die off, and then there's less stability. So before we had a bunch of different kind of plants, now suddenly a certain weed comes in and invades that area and all those different kinds of plants died off, and now we just have one weed, which makes it a much less stable ecosystem, because then once everything's died off and there's only weeds there, if the weed gets some type of virus and dies off, and the whole place is just gone, it's gone barren or whatever. So that can happen. There's also situations where African bees have invaded here in the United States. They've invaded areas, and they're very aggressive bees, and they've killed off other types of species of animal, attacked other bees, for example, that were native here, and they have actually been very aggressive and killed them off and made it a less stable ecosystem. So this whole concept of stability of an ecosystem is very important when we're really talking about food webs and food chains, specifically food webs. When you look at a food web and it's very, very complex, it is more likely to survive over time. When you're looking at a food web that is not very complex, it is less likely to survive over time. Here we're talking about microhabitats. Now, microhabitats are just, well, first of all, let's talk about what is a habitat. A habitat is the natural home or environment of an animal or a plant or other organism. So it's where they live. For example, your house, your home that you live in, that's your habitat. Now, what is a microhabitat? A habitat is a small or limited area surrounding a larger habitat. It's like a little oasis. For example, if you're in a forest and you walk around in a forest and you come across a log. Now the forest might be a habitat for many different creatures. Many things live in that forest. But there might be a microhabitat, such as a log that is sitting, that's fallen in that forest. And if I lift up the log, underneath it there's all kinds of bugs and things that are living there. That's a microhabitat. It's in the forest, but it has a certain type of specific property that that microhabitat has that the rest of the forest does not. You might find, say, a pond in the forest that has some fish in it. That's a little different than the surrounding forest. Or you might have a garden that humans are growing within a city. That's going to be different than the city environment. Or a creek that has some water that's running in it that might have different kinds of plants in the creek or around the creek that you wouldn't normally find in the forest. So these are little smaller habitats, microhabitats, that are within the larger scope of things. And so that's the difference between habitats and microhabitats when we're talking about various regions where animals live. Invasive species, I want to talk a little bit about that. I just mentioned it earlier, but I want to talk a little bit more about that. Some species will actually invade an environment or a habitat. Think of it as almost like an army invading a country. That's what these species sometimes do. These species have adapted to these similar environments that they invade, and what they often do is they kill off the native species, or the species that actually live there. It's very important to realize that whenever an invasive species comes in, it always decreases the biodiversity. It decreases the different kinds of organisms that live there. For one reason or another, it affects the entire ecosystem. Invasive species they grow really, really fast, and they reproduce really, really quickly, and they tend to take over all the resources in that area that are necessary. Many different native species may die
the original species that were where, and that one invasive species will dominate. And the key here is because only that one invasive species dominates, that makes the entire ecosystem less biodiverse because there are a few species there. Remember, an ecosystem is best able to survive and thrive when it has many different niches or jobs, and an organism uses those niches differently. And they have to use different parts of the ecosystem differently, so that no one species exactly dominates the entire ecosystem. We want as many different kinds of species, many different kinds of animals and plants and things like that in an ecosystem, and that makes the whole system thrive. Right here at the bottom, remember this always. The more different kinds of species, not the number of one species or the numbers of individual animals, but the different kinds that are available, means more stability for the entire ecosystem, because that means that the entire ecosystem is more likely to survive a catastrophic event.